Take it to another place. The second you get it, just join us.
Hello, my holy sisters and brothers. You've heard me say it before. That's really one of our very favorite songs in this world for both Nina and I. That is Shlomo Katz singing his Rova Chuppah Nigun, a melody originally written, brought down, shall we say, by Shlomo Carlebach. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Let's light up the darkness. We got some great stuff, again like last night, super relevant and applicable to our Passover seder tonight. Who's going to be with us as we get it going on a Tuesday night? Yehudit in South Carolina, James in Indianapolis, Paul in Chicago, Pauline in Arkansas, Stephen in New Hampshire, Gail in Virginia, Paul in the Great Northwest, Sandy in Michigan, Lucy in Minnesota. Christo in Lubbock, Texas says, good evening, got my first COVID vaccine dose earlier today. So happy now, ready to learn some Talmud. Fantastic, Christo. And I hope you don't experience any soreness or other side effects. Caroline in Raleigh, Melissa in Great Neck, Bill in Berkeley, Neil in Long Island, Paula got her first shot yesterday, Nancy in North Carolina, PK in Colorado, Alan in Wappingers Falls, Debbie in Toms River, New Jersey. Welcome, everybody. Over there on the YouTube side, Gigi in British Columbia, Neil in Virginia. Great to be with you all. Let me make sure I pause that, put it to the side. Okay. Where are we holding? This is Daf Kuf Yud Hey, page 115, here in Tractate Pesachim, the fourth volume of the Talmud, the Laws of Passover. We are in chapter 10, continuing today the discussion we opened yesterday, our analysis, or the Gemara, the Talmudic analysis of the third Mishna here in chapter 10. Specifically, we started talking yesterday about the bitter herb and the fact that we say two blessings relating to the vegetable at our Passover Seder. The first blessing near the beginning of the Seder experience, we just say a blessing on God. Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who creates the fruit of the earth. That's the standard blessing for vegetables. And usually we say it over karpas, but if we had to, we could say it over the chazeret, lettuce, right? So, and that is also the bitter herb. But when we're actually fulfilling our obligation to eat bitter herbs on Passover night, so then we say that second blessing a little bit later when we get into eating the ritual foods right before the festive meal. And even though we've already said, even if we're doing it with lettuce in both times, that opening at the beginning of the night when we say blessing over the vegetable, and then later we're going to be doing it again when we're fulfilling our obligation to eat the bitter herbs, still we would say both blessings. But of course the practice now is Now, even today, if you eat one vegetable at a meal and you say a blessing over it, so you've exempted all other vegetables, you don't have to say blessings again when you eat other vegetables, even if they're different species. But here, even though we say a blessing on that vegetable that we eat at the beginning of the dinner, these days usually parsley at the beginning of the seder, then later when we get to the part where we eat the bitter herb, these days often done with horseradish, then we say a new blessing, not over vegetables again, but this at the second instance, we would say, blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us over the bitter herb. And then when we eat that horseradish, it's not just to eat a vegetable. There we're consciously fulfilling our obligation to eat the bitter herb as stated in the Torah. As we'll see tonight, there's a bit of a dispute there and a bit of a nuance, because when the Torah commands us to eat bitter herbs, the commandment in the Torah is that you shall eat the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb, that lamb or goat offering, which we were only able to eat at the time that the temple was standing and previously when the tabernacle was standing. But the point is, when we had priests serving and an altar, and then the Paschal lamb could be sacrificed in Jerusalem or wherever the Mishkan was standing. When we were wandering in the wilderness, it was moving from place to place. But every year at Passover, we would bring that offering, and then we would eat a piece of that meat, of the lamb or of the goat, with matzah and bitter herbs. Once the temple was destroyed about 2,000 years ago, we could no longer bring the Pesach. We could no longer bring the Paschal lamb, slaughter it, and eat it on Passover night. And that's why we don't eat lamb on Passover night. So if we can no longer fulfill that Torah obligation to eat that meat, which is supposed to be eaten with matzah and bitter herbs, we definitely have a specific commandment in the Torah to eat matzah on the first night of Passover. But then the question is, do we have a Torah commandment to eat bitter herbs? No, before, the bitter herbs was part of eating the lamb. We can no longer eat the lamb. So why do we eat the bitter herb? And as we'll see, we do eat the bitter herb, but it is not a Torah commandment to eat bitter herb by itself. It's a rabbinic decree. And because it's a rabbinic decree, which we do in memory and remembrance of the fact that we used to eat the Korban Pesach, but now if we're fulfilling a rabbinic decree rather than a Torah law, and so that causes some interesting consequences as a result, and we'll be seeing that tonight. Okay, so let's get into it. Everything is good. Okay. All right, so we're starting just a few lines down from the top of page 115 on the A side. Ravina said, Rav Misharshia, the son of Rav Nassan, said to me that Hillel said as follows, citing a tradition, meaning he had learned it from his master, who learned it from his master, his teacher, who learned it from his teacher. A person should not wrap matzah and bitter herbs together and eat them. He ruled in this manner because he maintains that today, after the destruction of the temple, the obligation to eat matzah applies by Torah law, and the obligation to eat bitter herbs without the Paschal lamb applies by rabbinic law. And if one were to wrap them together, the bitter herbs, whose obligation applies by rabbinic law, would come and nullify the matzah, whose obligation applies by Torah law. Now, why is it that eating one food which is by rabbinic decree, if you ate it at the same time as another food which we're obligated to eat by Torah law, why would that kind of lower level obligation come and nullify that higher level obligation? That's a little bit unclear. There's a note on this. Well, they're going to argue about it, and then we'll come back. So let's just hear what they're saying. And so even according to the one who says that mitzvahs do not nullify each other, that principle only applies to a mixture of one food whose obligation applies by Torah law with another food whose obligation applies by Torah law, or to mixture of one food whose obligation is by rabbinic law mixed with another food whose obligation is by rabbinic law. However, in a case of a mixture of one food whose obligation is by Torah law mixed with another food whose obligation applies by rabbinic law, so the food whose obligation applies only by rabbinic law comes and nullifies the food whose obligation applies by Torah law. Meaning that when you have an obligation to eat a food by Torah law, you shouldn't go mixing it with other foods. You should make sure that you're making a clear distinction and eating that thing that you are obligated to do. And maybe you won't nullify these things if you're eating two foods that are both obligated by Torah law. But where one is obligated by Torah law and another one has a lower level obligation, it's like, you're messing up your fulfillment of the obligation to eat that food by Torah law. Eating matzah on Passover night, the first night of Passover, is a Torah obligation. It is also a Torah obligation to eat the Paschal lamb with bitter herb, but we can no longer eat the Paschal lamb because the temple is not standing. And so if we eat bitter herb on the first night of Passover, it's as a rabbinic decree to recall the way that it used to be, not as a Torah law. The Gemara asks, who is the Tana that you heard say that mitzvahs do not nullify each other? It is Hillel. As it was taught in a Baraisa, they said about Hillel that he would wrap matzah and bitter herbs together and eat them. As it is stated in the Torah, they shall eat it with matzah and bitter herbs, which indicates that these two foods should be consumed together. And Rabbi Yochanan said, Hillel's colleagues disagree with him. As it was taught in another Baraisa, I might have thought that one should wrap the matzah and bitter herbs together and eat them in the manner that Hillel eats them. Therefore, the verse states, they shall eat it with matzah and bitter herbs, meaning that one may eat even this, the matzah, by itself, and that, the bitter herbs, by themselves. Rav Ashi strongly objects to this proof. If so, if the sages disagree with Hillel and maintain that the mitzvahs nullify each other, what is the meaning of the word even in the Baraisa? The wording indicates that Hillel's opinion is not rejected entirely, but that one fulfills his obligation even if he eats the items without combining them. Now, if you're thinking back to seders that you've been to, do we eat matzah with bitter herbs together? Yes, we do. And we call it the Hillel sandwich. But when we eat matzah with bitter herbs together, do we say a blessing on that eating? No, we do not. We say another blessing earlier on matzah because we're fulfilling an obligation to eat matzah, and we're eating bread, by the way. So those are two different blessings right there. And when we eat bitter herbs by itself, or we actually dip it a little bit in haroset, but it's really eating the bitter herb by itself, we say a blessing on that when we're fulfilling our obligation to eat bitter herbs. But when we actually eat the matzah and bitter herbs together and we call it a Hillel sandwich, we don't say a blessing on that. And the reason is we're not fulfilling an obligation by eating the matzah and bitter herbs together. What are we doing? We are making a remembrance of the fact that when the temple stood, then they would make a sandwich of matzah, bitter herbs, and lamb. And there you were fulfilling the obligation to eat the lamb with matzah and bitter herbs. Now that the lamb is not there, we only do it as a remembrance. Furthermore, when we think of the Hillel sandwich, we're always thinking of the famous Hillel, right? The famous Hillel who said, when he was asked, can you teach me the entire Torah standing on one leg? And he said, yes, I can do that. That which is hateful to you, don't do it to your fellow. The rest is commentary. Now go and learn. He said that to somebody who was actually trying to provoke him and mock him, but he was so impressed with Hillel's, wise and short and kind answer that he actually went and learned Torah and converted to Judaism and ended up being very thankful that he'd been brought under the wings of the divine presence by Hillel's kindness and patience. However, that famous Hillel is not the Hillel of the Hillel sandwich. How do we know that? Because the Hillel, who's the famous Hillel, lived when the second temple was standing. The Hillel, who was a colleague of Shammai, lived when the second temple was still standing. So he did eat the lamb. And he wasn't eating just matzah and bitter herb as a remembrance of the time when they could eat the lamb along with these other foods. Rather, it's a descendant of Hillel, a later Hillel, who was also the Nasi. He was a great Torah scholar in his own right, but he lived much later, and it's that later Hillel, it's his sandwich that he did as a remembrance of the way things used to be, and it's that same Hillel who established the calendar that we still follow today, meaning as opposed to having witnesses testify before the Sanhedrin that they've seen the new moon, and then the new month gets declared. Now it's all been calculated in advance, and there's no longer any testimony before Sanhedrin to establish that a new month has started, and it was Hillel who instituted that calendar, which we still follow today. Hillel the Younger, the later Hillel. So I didn't know that until I read this. That was fascinating to me. Of course, we all thought the Hillel sandwich, it must be the great Hillel, but it's not. It's a later Hillel. So now we know that. Okay, let us continue. Now, rather, Rav Ash, wait a minute, let me make sure. Yeah, I said Hillel's colleagues disagree with him. Okay, so rather, Rav Ashi said, this is what this Tana is teaching. I might have thought that one fulfills his obligation with them only if he wraps matzah and bitter herbs together. And by the way, they keep using the verb wrap. Now, when we think of that Hillel sandwich, what are we thinking of? Crispy matzah, that we put some of the bitter herbs on top of it, right? And another bit of matzah on top of it. How can you wrap, matzah that if you try to bend it, it breaks? And the answer is because matzah in ancient times was not stiff and crumbly. It was soft. It was much more like a tortilla, right? It was unleavened bread, but it was soft, and you could wrap the bitter herb or the lamb or anything else into it. Okay, so Rav Ashi said, this is what the Tana is teaching. I might have thought that one fulfills his obligation with them only if he wraps matzah and bitter herbs together and eats them in the manner that Hillel eats them. Therefore, the verse states, they shall eat it with matzah and bitter herbs, i.e., one fulfills his obligation even if he eats the matzah by itself and the bitter herbs by themselves. You don't have to mix it together. And the halacha, let's just read the law with regard to wrapping matzah and bitter herbs. After one has recited the blessing and eaten an olive's volume of matzah, right, an olive bulk about the size of an olive worth of matzah, and recited the blessing over bitter herbs, and eaten an olive bulk of bitter herbs, right? So you made a blessing on matzah, you ate matzah. You made a blessing over eating bitter herbs, and then you ate bitter herbs. And only then you prepare a sandwich together of matzah and bitter herbs, which is eaten without a blessing. And at that point one reclines and recites the phrase, in remembrance of the temple, in the manner of Hillel. Right? So we don't say a blessing for that, and it's as we discussed earlier, that is the law. The Gemara comments, now that the halacha was stated neither in accordance with the opinion of Hillel, nor in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, one recites the blessing commanded us over eating matzah and eats matzah to fulfill his obligation. And then he recites the blessing commanded us over eating bitter herbs and eats the bitter herbs. And then he eats the matzah and bitter herbs together without a blessing in remembrance of the temple in the manner of Hillel. So there's the statement that we just read in the halacha. Rabbi Elazar said that Rav Oshaya said, anything that is dipped in a liquid before it is eaten requires the ritual of washing the hands. The obligation to wash one's hands was instituted to preserve ritual purity, tahara, and to prevent people from causing teruma food to contract ritual impurity. So where does washing the hands come from? It's very interesting. It's that the hands were understood to always be a little bit dirty, and they would transmit tuma, ritual impurity, to objects that they touch. Food does not become susceptible to becoming tameh, to becoming ritually impure, until it has also touched one of the 7 liquids. Are they listed here? One of the 7 liquids. Well, they're here somewhere, but it's like it's water, wine, blood, honey, and there's 3 oil from olives, and 2 others that I can't remember right now. But there's 7 liquids that I think dew is actually different than water. So there's 7 liquids which make it so that it's possible for it to contract ritual impurity. So if you're going to be dipping a dry food, right, into a liquid, so you know it's going to be susceptible to impurity, so they adopted the custom of washing their hands first before they dip a dry food into a liquid, since that would make it ready to become impure. And if the hands were impure from something, then they would transmit that ritual impurity. Now, for most people, if the food becomes ritually impure, it doesn't matter. We're not talking about hygiene here. This is ritual impurity. But teruma is that food which is set aside only for the priests to eat. Only Kohanim can eat teruma. But teruma, when the priests eat it, must be tahor, must be ritually pure. So the risk is that you might have food in front of you, which is teruma. You might come to touch it when your hands are tameh, and then you would ruin that food. Now the priest couldn't eat it. And so that's why they instituted washing hands. And so that when we wash our hands before eating bread, then we have to we wash our hands and say a blessing over washing the hands. Then we go say a blessing over the bread and eat the bread. When you're washing your hands just to eat some food that's going to be dipped, but it's not bread, you wash your hands, but you don't say a blessing in that instance. And that does come up at the Passover seder, as we will see. Rav Papa said, learn from this halacha, which requires the washing of hands, that for this lettuce, meaning the bitter herb, on Passover, one must submerge it in the charoset due to the bitterness and the poison in the lettuce. So the charoset is the dip, right? And this charoset, it's very sweet and tasty. What's it made out of? Nuts, raisins, right? Nuts and raisins, and a little bit of wine or grape juice, and apples are often in it. And it's reminiscent of the mortar that we used to put the bricks together when we were slaves in Egypt. But you use it as a dip, and you dip the bitter herb into it. For it could enter your mind that one need not thoroughly submerge the lettuce in the charoset. So why do I need to wash the hands before eating the bitter herbs? He did not touch the liquid with his hands, and therefore he did not render it ritually impure. The Gemara rejects this contention. Actually, I will say to you, according to the halacha, the law, one need not submerge the lettuce in charoset, and the poison dies anyway. The poison is nullified by the smell of the charoset. The Gemara, right, because you're using a lettuce as the bitter herb, it's a bitter lettuce, and that lettuce might have some kind of a poison in it, or some kind of a bug or a worm that wasn't able to be washed away, and this charoset, sort of nullifies the danger of these extraneous materials that could be on that bitter herb, even if it was washed. And the Gemara asks, but in that case, why do I need the washing of hands before dipping? And the Gemara answers, perhaps one will submerge the lettuce, and it is therefore necessary to wash one's hands to avoid the possible transfer of ritual impurity, tuma. And Rav Papa said, a person should not leave bitter herbs in the charoset for a lengthy period of time, lest the sweetness of the spices in the charoset nullify its bitterness. So we dip the bitter herb in the charoset, but only a brief dip, right? And it can't kill the bitterness, right? The bitter herbs need to taste bitter so you can fulfill your obligation to eat bitter herbs. Rav Chisda authorized Rabbana Ukva to deliver a lecture, and he taught if one washed his hands for the first dipping, at the beginning of the seder, when you dip the karpas, these days we do parsley and salt water, he should wash his hands again for the second dipping. What is the law on this? Dipping the herbs in charoset. The bitter herbs are dipped in charoset to neutralize the poison they contain. In most places, the custom is to dip only a part of the herb. In any case, one should not leave the bitter herbs in the charoset long enough to weaken the bitterness. The hands are washed without a blessing for the vegetables at the beginning of the seder, the karpas. Later, one washes his hands again and recites a blessing before eating matzah. That's the law today. Rav Papa said to them, on the contrary, this halacha was stated specifically here with regard to Passover night. For if it should enter your mind that it was stated in general, why do I need 2 dippings? A person usually dips only once, either at the beginning or in the middle of his meal. And the Gemara asks, rather, what will you say? This halacha was stated specifically here with regard to Passover night? If so, why do I need 2 washings of the hands? He has already washed his hands once. And they say in response, since he needs to recite the Haggadah, the script, right, of the Passover meal, which contains the blessings and the story of the Jews being enslaved in Egypt, and Hallel, the praise of God that we recite on all holidays. By the Passover Seder, we say part of the Hallel before the festive meal and part of the Hallel after the grace after the meal. Since he needs to recite the Haggadah and Hallel in between the 2 dippings, perhaps he will divert his thoughts and his hands will touch a ritually impure object. Again, these days, we're really not concerned with Tuma and Tahara. It's like the whole world is assumed to be Tameh, ritually impure, and priests aren't eating teruma, etc. But of course, we still study these laws because when Mashiach comes, when the Messiah comes, the 3rd temple will be rebuilt, and these matters will be, practical matters again. Meantime, we just study the laws. Rava said, if one swallowed matzah without chewing it, he has fulfilled the obligation to eat matzah because he has consumed it. However, if one swallowed bitter herbs without chewing them, he has not fulfilled his obligation as he did not taste their bitterness. Furthermore, if one swallowed matzah and bitter herbs together, he has fulfilled the obligation of eating matzah, but he has not fulfilled the obligation of eating bitter herbs. If one wrapped matzah and bitter herbs in something else, and then the example that the Gemara gives is the sort of fibers, the network of fibers that wrap a palm tree, that naturally grow on a palm tree. But if you wrapped anything around the matzah and then ate the matzah, then you didn't fulfill your obligation to eat matzah, right? So that's the lesson there. Rav Shimi Bar Ashi said matzah must be placed before each and every participant at the seder. Okay, the next part of the discussion, you got to have that picture in your mind. If I still have that, of the seating arrangement. No, I don't have that. But remember, they don't sit in chairs around a table at the seder. In ancient times, each person lay on a kind of a daybed, like a couch, leaning on his left side. And there was no big communal table in the middle of everybody. Rather, each person had a tray of food in front of their own private couch. So get that picture in your mind when you hear that Rav Shimi Bar Ashi said matzah must be placed before each and every participant at the seder. Each participant in a seder would recline on a couch at his own personal table. Likewise, bitter herbs must be placed before each and every participant, and charoset must be placed before each and every participant. And during the seder, before the meal, one may remove the table only from before the one who is reciting the Haggadah. So they have the idea here, these days it's very common that we all recite the Haggadah. Like I read a paragraph, the next person reads a paragraph, the next person reads a paragraph. But back then it was much more common for the leader of the seder to recite all of the Haggadah. And so they're saying that one may remove the table only from the one who is reciting the Haggadah, and the other tables, which correspond to the seder plates used nowadays, are left in their place. Just as today, we don't remove the seder plate, which contains all of the ritual foods on it. We don't remove the seder plate, at any point during the recitation of the Haggadah. It has to be there. Just as in the old times, they might take the table away from before the one reciting the Haggadah, but the ritual foods would be there in front of each of the other participants of the Seder. Rav Huna says, all of the aforementioned foods, i.e. matzah, bitter herbs, and charoset, must also be placed only before the one who recites the Haggadah, according to Rav Huna. And when the time comes to eat these items, all the other participants receive their portion from him, from his plate. And the Gemara comments, and the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rav Huna. So let's read these halachas. The arrangement of the Seder plate. The Seder plate is brought before the leader of the Seder, and there is no need to place a similar Seder plate with its ritual foods before the other guests at the table. There's one Seder plate for everybody. With regard to removing the table, after the recitation of the passage beginning, "This poor bread," which opens the Magid, the story part of the Haggadah, the matzah is removed from the table or placed at its edge as though a meal has been completed. Today, the practice is not to remove the matzah, as the children already know that they are not there to be eaten at this time. Nevertheless, it is a custom to cover the matzah during the Haggadah reading at the Seder table. And the Gemara asks, why does one remove the table? The school of Rabbi Yanai say, so that the children will notice that something is unusual and they will ask, why is this night different from all other nights? And the Gemara relates, Abaye was sitting before Rabbah when he was still a child, and he saw that they were removing the table from before him, before Rabbah, and he said to those removing it, we have not yet eaten, and you are taking the table away from us? Rabbah said to him, you have exempted us from reciting the questions of why is this night different, as you have already asked what is special about the Seder night. And so, as we've seen already on a few of these pages that we've covered in the last few days, it's so important that the Seder dinner, the Passover dinner, and the Seder which precedes it is just different in every way from every other night of the year. That we're already just used to that. I mean, obviously it's different. It's the Seder. We have this, we have that. It's a big ceremony. It's a big deal. We're all dressed up. I mean, it's totally different than every other dinner of the year. And that's such a given that it's like, we don't ask why is this night different from all other nights. We know it's different, and we just leave that as part of the script for the children to recite. But as we've seen, many of the traditions of the Seder were just to make it different. Some of the things that we do are fulfilling an obligation. We must eat matzah. We must eat bitter herbs. But this idea of covering the matzah, moving the matzah, raising the Seder plate, dipping twice, making the blessing over vegetable at the beginning, and then again over a different vegetable with the obligation to eat bitter herbs, etc. Many of the elements of the Seder dinner were designed just to make the night different from other nights, not just to make it different for random reason or just to make it special, but rather because it says in the Torah, and when your child will ask you, right, on that day, what does this mean to you? And you will answer him, right? So you want the children should ask. And that's why the sages arranged that the dinner should be so different and elements of that experience should be so different so that hopefully it would stimulate the young children at the table to say, hey, what's going on? Why is this night so different? And then, we tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. I'm almost done, so if you've got questions and comments, make sure you get them in there. Shmuel said that the phrase, the bread of affliction, lechem oni, at Deuteronomy 16:3. What does that mean, lechem oni? It means bread over which one answers onim, matters, i.e. one recites the Haggadah over matzah. And that was also taught in a baraisa. Lechem oni is bread over which one answers many matters. Literally, right? Literally, the seder is a time of asking and answering questions. And the bread that we eat that night is the bread over which one asks and answers questions. Alternatively, in the verse lechem oni, is actually written without a vav, which means a poor person. And so just as it is the manner of a poor person to eat a piece of bread for lack of a whole loaf, so too here he should use a piece of matzah, not a whole loaf. Alternatively, just as the manner of a poor person is that he heats the oven and his wife bakes quickly before the small amount of wood that they have is used up, so too here, when baking matzah, he heats the oven and his wife bakes quickly so that the dough doesn't have time to rise. And this is why matzah is called poor man's bread. Of course, it also has that more direct symbolism that we were slaves in Egypt, and nobody is more poor than a slave. A slave doesn't own anything, right? Anything that a slave owns is owned by his master because he is owned by his master. That's how poor we were when we were enslaved in Egypt. And so when we say this is the bread of affliction, let all who are hungry come and eat, it doesn't take that much thinking to say, well, why is it called the bread of affliction? We get it, right? But what's interesting is that it's also play on words, and that phrase lechem oni also means the bread over which matters or questions are answered, which is pretty interesting. Okay, let's get to your comments and questions here on page 115. Neil, you are such a wonderful educator. Would you consider sharing some of your techniques that you use to keep your seders engaging for your family? Well, thank you, Neil. That's a lovely thing to say. I really appreciate it. I'll say this, a couple of things that we do. I think I've mentioned this before. I'm going to mention it again because it's so important. We've already seen that if you want to beautify a mitzvah, you should really have intentionality when you're doing it. Likewise, you should get inside that mitzvah and get inside the intention of it so that it's personally meaningful to you. So part of the mitzvah, the obligation of Passover, is to recite the story, right? That we were slaves in Egypt and Pharaoh oppressed us, and eventually God redeemed us from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, and then he drowned our oppressors in the Red Sea. I mean, that's a vast abridgment of the story, but you get what I mean. But it still can feel very remote to us, very remote, like something that happened so long ago. And we are also obligated to regard ourselves as if we personally came out of Egypt. But none of us have this memory, unless we have serious ability to get into past lives or something, of being slaves in Egypt and coming out of Egypt thanks to God's miracles. How can we make that experience of viewing ourselves as enslaved to Pharaoh, how can we make that personal? And the answer is each of us has a Pharaoh. There's no question. Each of us has a Pharaoh. We have, tragically, many of us have many pharaohs, right? But what is a pharaoh? It's some kind of a destructive pattern of behavior that we know we should not behave that way, and we do it anyway. We know we shouldn't do that, and we do it anyway. That's a form of enslavement. So that's a pharaoh. It could be I'm too loud, I'm too quiet, I'm too aggressive, I let people walk over me. I smoke cigarettes, I want to quit, I overeat. I mean, everybody has their own destructive behavior that they can't seem to get rid of. That's your pharaoh. So if in advance you think to yourself, okay, that's my pharaoh. This is the year that I'm going to ask God to help me overcome my pharaoh. I'm serious. I want to break out of that enslavement, so you can do it. And you need to think that through before Passover. So one thing we've done in the past is when we're having guests at our seder, we tell them this in advance, a couple of weeks before. We want to make the Passover experience personal. Think of what is your pharaoh. Don't tell anybody. That's personal. You don't have to tell people what demons you're fighting. But know for yourself what your pharaoh is. Even write it down. One thing you can actually do is write it down. Don't show the paper to anyone. But just before the seder begins, you can burn that little piece of paper. If you have a fireplace, nice. If not, an ashtray, a trash can. You burn that piece of paper. And now when we read the Haggadah, every time we read pharaoh, each person is thinking about their own personal pharaoh. And you're asking God to help you break free of it. Now, is it going to happen? You've already taken a big step by identifying, being organized, and thinking at the Seder that I need God's help to break free of that pharaoh. Then on the second night of Passover, we also start counting the Omer. And so now we have 50 days until we celebrate the revelation of Torah at Mount Sinai during the holiday of Shavuos, where we start to really live a life that is free of that pharaoh. And we acknowledge that it's a fragile new life. It's so easy to backslide into that old destructive behavior. But if you follow this system, you really have a great chance of breaking free from that behavior. That's one thing that we do to make the Passover Seder, sort of interesting and fun and good for people. Another is to put unusual objects on the Seder table that should lead people to say, why is that highlighter on the Seder table? Preferably, it should be something that's not muktzah, like a pen. So you wouldn't use that. But like an unusual piece of food, a fruit, an apple, a banana on the Seder table. Like, why is that there? And then you'd say, very good. You just fulfilled your obligation to ask a question. And then you should have some kind of symbolic idea of what a banana means to you at Seder. Another thing that I think is fantastic, we've been doing this for a few years when we're hosting a Seder at home, is we set up the dinner table for the festive meal, but we read the Haggadah in the living room or in the family room, seated on couches, comfortable, reclining, possibly even with some snacks there before we start so people aren't starving and only thinking about when we get to the festive meal. And that is much more conducive to conversation. And when I'm talking about putting these symbolic objects on the Seder table, I certainly don't mean on the Seder plate, just on the table where it will lead people to ask questions. And it doesn't have to be foods. You could put a slinky or a tennis ball or a baseball, something like that on the Seder table, something that's totally out of place and that is meaningful to at least one person. So another thing you can have people do is say, please bring an object that is symbolic for you and just place it on the Seder table, not on the Seder plate. With respect to snacks, so that people aren't so hungry, you would eat that in the daytime before you start the Seder and before you start talking about the Haggadah, because at that point it's too late for the snacks. But the idea is that people don't have to be so starving that all they can think about is let's race through the Haggadah and get to the festive meal. So if they eat a little bit before you all sit down, it's not a bad thing. Unless you're, and if for children, it's even more allowable that they could eat a little food. Okay. Peter says, do the Sephardim eat lamb on Passover? I believe that in some traditions, and maybe it's the Sephardim. I'm not sure about that. We definitely don't. I think the Sephardic community will eat lamb on Passover, but they certainly would not roast a whole lamb, which was the manner of the Paschal lamb. It had to be cooked in its entirety, right? Maybe they would roast a leg of lamb or something like that. But in the Ashkenazic communities, we would not eat lamb on Passover out of respect to the fact that the temple was destroyed long ago. And so even in the communities where they would eat lamb that night, they would not roast a whole lamb because that was the manner of cooking the Paschal lamb. Michael says, confused. If lettuce is bitter herbs, then what is horseradish? Is lettuce the carpus or the bitter herbs? Right, so these days, like in our family, the carpus is parsley, and the maror, the bitter herbs, is horseradish. That's how we do it, right? What they're saying in the Gemara is that the ideal kind of bitter herb is lettuce, and that if you only have lettuce, then you could eat lettuce at the beginning of the meal and for the bitter herb. But it is highly preferable, even according to the Gemara, that you would have a different vegetable for the beginning, where you're kind of talking about the cycle of life and the springtime and the reemergence of life after winter. And that's often what we think about when we're eating that parsley at the beginning of the meal, that it should be a different vegetable than what you're going to eat for the bitter herb. But it's interesting that kind of the ideal bitter herb, according to the Gemara, is lettuce, is romaine lettuce, because it sort of begins not so unpleasant, but if you keep chewing it, it gets more bitter, sort of like our experience in Egypt. These days, on seder plates, there usually is a place for chazeret, right, for lettuce. And it's just kind of like you can put it there, being mindful of the tradition, even though you might use parsley for the carpus and horseradish for the bitter herb. Some people will use the lettuce for the bitter herb. I mean, there's different ways to do it. But definitely in our tradition, both my mother and father's side, my father's side from Ukraine, my mother's side from Hungary, the bitter herb was horseradish. And the sharper, more pungent the horseradish, the better. And we always used to joke in our home, that if you feel that, you made a lot of transgressions in the past year, you should eat a bigger portion of the horseradish so it really clears out your sinuses. Okay, so in terms of other practices that can make the Seder interesting, I'm not getting something that's coming to mind right now. But it definitely, really the best thing that you can have is a nice freewheeling conversation where you go off script constantly, where people are asking questions. And so one of the best ways to do that is to just tell all the participants, hey, please bring, either a question or a little teaching about Passover, something that appeals to you. Whatever you think is interesting. So they bring some topics, and people are sharing some Torah that's not just, dry reading of the Haggadah, but rather is a real conversation back and forth, in the manner of Chavrusa, in the manner of people learning Torah together who are there to do it. Often we have guests at the Seder who are not learning Torah at all at any other time of the year. And so it's important, that when they come and have that experience with us, that it should be stimulating, it should be fun, and it shouldn't feel like just some kind of a dry recitation of a script. Okay, that's what I've got for us this evening. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, Wednesday, the normal time, the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.